back to 1999.
So Destruction Derby 64 came out in 99 on the Nintendo 64.
Kind of late in the N64's life cycle, wasn't it?
Yeah, a little bit. Developed by Looking Glass Studios and then published by THQ.
Under license from Psygnosis.
The OG Destruction Derby folks.
It's kind of wild, right? You've got this studio known for intricate level design, like Thief.
Yeah.
Taking on a genre that's pure, like, high-octane action.
Yeah, it's almost like mixing like oil and water.
Yeah.
But they made something unique.
They did.
And speaking of unique, what made this game stand out? Even back then.
Well, imagine this. You're on a racetrack. Race starts, but half the cars are coming right at you.
Whoa.
Reverse racing. One of DD64's signature twists.
Got to think defensively right away.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it ties right into how you score points, too.
It's not just about finishing first.
Not just. No, you get rewarded for surviving, of course, but also for how much destruction you cause.
So it's like controlled chaos.
Exactly.
Now, okay, get ready for this. Wikipedia says the game only had like 10 total damage variations for the cars.
10.
Can you picture that today?
It's a real throwback to the tech limits back then, but maybe that forced them to be creative.
So instead of like super realistic damage,
right, where every dent and scratch is modeled,
they had to work with just a few variations.
Yeah, they had to convey that destruction feeling, the impact.
Yeah.
Using just a few visual cues.
I can just picture those cars bouncing around like rubber toys or something.
Yeah. And on top of all that chaos, there's one mode that people seem to love. Capture the flag.
Wait, capture the flag in a Destruction Derby
game. Not exactly what you'd expect, is it?
No.
But it shows how Looking Glass was willing to try things, to like push the genre, adding a mode that needed teamwork, strategy.
It wasn't just mindless crashing.
No, not at all.
And it's still relevant today.
Think about all the big multiplayer games that use capture the flag. Or variations on it. Timeless concept.
So it worked even back in the N64 days.
For sure.
Speaking of the N64 days, let's put on those 2024 glasses.
Okay, yeah.
How do these graphics look now? The IGN review said they were grainy. They also mentioned the limited damage models, making it look kind of rough.
Not exactly glowing praise.
No, not really. But is that fair? You know, thinking about the tech back then.
Yeah, remember the N64 was like pushing the limits of 3D graphics in '99?
Compared to what we have now, yeah.
Huge difference. We can't just judge it on how it looks today.
Got to consider the context.
Right.
So instead of comparing it to, say, Wreckfest,
yeah,
with those crazy detailed environments and the way the cars deform realistically,
yeah,
we should ask, how did this game compare to other N64 games?
Exactly. Were the graphics considered good then? Did they get that feeling of speed and destruction across?
That's what really matters.
Yeah.
And to really answer that, we might need to like actually see some gameplay footage.
It's one thing to read grainy, it's another to actually see it.
Experience it how people did back then. Maybe those limitations, those visual quirks, actually made the game charming.
Maybe they did. Like, it's like comparing a hand-drawn animation to a modern CGI film.
Ah, I see what you mean.
Both can be visually stunning, but they do it differently.
And sometimes those limitations push people to be more creative.
Yeah, it's true. Like, constraints can force you to invent new things.
Okay, so we've talked about the graphics, but how does the actual gameplay, like the driving, the physics, compare to what we expect now?
Yeah.
That IGN review said the cars felt floaty.
Okay, so maybe the handling wasn't super tight.
And they said the collisions didn't feel weighty enough.
But again, context is key.
Right.
Physics engines back then were nowhere near as complex as what we have today. So maybe the handling wasn't super realistic, but did it work for the game? Did it make it fun?
They also said, and this is kind of funny, they said seeing other cars in the distance was like shimmering blurs of color.
Haha, limited draw distance.
Big time.
You don't see that in games now with their huge, detailed worlds. But, you know, maybe that limited visibility actually made it more exciting. You never knew what was going to hit you.
Yeah, like driving in thick fog or something.
Yeah, exactly. Got to rely on your gut.
All right, so we've talked about the development, those unique features, and started looking at it through a 2024 lens. But let's step back for a sec. How did the critics react back in '99? What did people think about Destruction Derby 64?
From what we've got here, it sounds like it got mixed reviews.
Mixed.
Yeah, some people loved the chaos and the game modes. Others said the graphics were outdated, the controls clunky.
Kind of divisive even back then.
Seems like it.
So let's dive into those reviews a little deeper. What can we learn?
Let's start with that IGN review you mentioned. They didn't hold back, calling it a shadow of the outdated PSX game. Ouch.
They thought it didn't live up to what it could have been, maybe.
Yeah, or even a step back from earlier games in the series.
And then there's that line about the music synthesized whale song. I can't even imagine what that sounds like.
It's definitely a memorable way to describe the music.
Those reviewers, they had some strong opinions, good and bad. So, from an expert's perspective, were they right to criticize it back then? And do those problems stand out even more now?
That's a great question, and one we're going to tackle in part 2 of our deep dive.
Stay tuned, because we're going to find out if Destruction Derby 64's successes and failures hold any lessons for game developers today.
It's going to be interesting. Okay, so let's get back to those criticisms from back in '99. Was Destruction Derby 64 really a shadow of its predecessors, or are those reviewers, like, missing something?
It's hard to separate nostalgia from, actual analysis.
Yeah.
What was cool back then might seem outdated now, but were those criticisms fair in 1999?
Yeah, good point. Like, take the graphics, for example.
Right.
IGN called them grainy, and looking back at N64 footage, they probably had a point. But were they actually bad for 1999?
That's the tough part. Gotta remember, everything was changing so fast back then.
Yeah.
PlayStation had just brought 3D gaming to the masses. The N64 was pushing it even further.
It wasn't about photorealism yet,
Yeah.
more about creating these immersive 3D worlds, and DD64 did do that.
It did, so we have to judge it within its time.
Exactly. Like maybe those grainy textures, the limited draw distance, that was the trade-off for having 20 cars smashing into each other on the N64.
Yeah, maybe. And you know what? Maybe those limitations even added to the gameplay.
How so?
Like imagine you see a shimmering blurb of color in the distance. Could be a friend. Could be an enemy about to wreck you.
Adds a little suspense.
Right. You wouldn't get that with today's graphics.
True. Everything's so clear and crisp now.
Speaking of things that aren't so clear, what about those 10 damage variations?
Ah, yes.
On paper, sounds kind of ridiculous, right? But how did it actually play out?
That's where those old player reviews and videos come in handy.
Yeah.
We can see how the devs used those limited variations to show how damaged a car was. Maybe they exaggerated certain things or tied them to the gameplay somehow.
Like maybe a super damaged car would start smoking, sputtering.
Or become harder to control.
Exactly. Limitations can force you to be more creative, right?
Oh, definitely. Gotta find clever ways to communicate stuff to make the game better.
So the damage model, maybe it wasn't the prettiest, but it might have actually made the game more fun, more unique.
And that's key. We get so hung up on the tech stuff, the graphics, the sound, but it's the gameplay, the feel that truly matters.
Speaking of feel, let's talk about the physics. IGN mentioned the cars felt floaty.
Right. Maybe not the tightest handling.
But arcade-style physics were super common back then.
Oh, yeah. It was about fun, not being a sim.
And in a game like Destruction Derby 64, that makes sense, right? It's not about racing perfectly, it's about surviving, causing mayhem.
A more forgiving physics model probably made it more fun, more crazy crashes.
Yeah, so maybe the physics weren't realistic, but they worked for what the game was trying to do.
Right. And that brings us back to that innovative scoring system. It wasn't just about coming in first.
Right.
You had to survive, be strategic, rack up points by driving well, A and D by wrecking stuff.